Good evening, and welcome to a Racism's Forum on the African American community and COVID. We're here tonight because we're in crises. We're in crises not just because of COVID, but because COVID is exacerbated in communities of color due to poverty, access, lack of understanding. We recognize that when America catches a cold, Black America and Brown America catch pneumonia. We are suffering disproportionately from the illnesses that are ravaging America. That disproportionate suffering is due to poverty, lack of access, lack of real policy making that helps us put our arms around this issue. Fortunately, America's made a choice that the top decision makers in our nation have been replaced by people who are putting science, logic, and a moral imperative in front of this issue. On a local level, many of us have expressed concern about access and information. Racism is not new to this area. We've been working on issues for Black and Brown people as individuals and collectively since last year. As individuals, we have been elected or chosen or called or are founders of African American and Brown organizations that have a constituency. We operate schools. We're in civic organizations. We represent Black women political issues. We're pastors of churches. We run nonprofits. Hundreds, thousands of Black and Brown lives come in contact with our organizations. We take seriously our role to advocate for this community. When we see hostility towards the issues of Black and Brown people, we feel it imperative that we act and act with precision and knowledge. You may remember, as an organizing group last year, we called together thousands of Solano County residents, and thousands came from outside of Solano County. We marched. We stood together. There were a number of issues that were impacting us. Our city had someone on a city commission that felt the need to call someone an uppity Negro. We spoke out against that. It's my understanding that that is about to reoccur, and we'll deal with that again. We came tonight to say, if Black lives matter, they must matter around the issues of COVID. And so tonight, we're going to explore the history of racial medical inequities. We're going to explore access. We're going to hear from two African American doctors. They're going to talk to us about everything COVID. Their medical expertise will answer our questions. We will gather your questions from online, compile them, and they will be asked. As well as understanding that this is not just a medical issue. It's an issue of distribution. It's an issue of government effectiveness. I'm pleased that when I had concerns and we had concerns, we were able to reach out to our county supervisor. Not only did she respond, but she's agreed to be with us tonight. And she's helping us right now make sure we give access to thousands of our seniors to the COVID vaccine that will occur this weekend. We're going to give you details. Look, this is not going to go away overnight. Our frustrations won't disappear. The fear of this virus won't go away. And yet we have more power than we acknowledge. I want to thank the organizers of Racism, our partner organizations, Elite, Community Democratic Club, Friendship Missionary Baptist Church, and New Dawn. I want to thank everyone who is tuning in, and I'm going to ask you now to share this most critical event with everyone you can. Now, we realize that the most vulnerable populations may not have access to technology. So I want you to listen tonight, not just for yourself, but for your grandparents, your aunts, your cousins, those of whom aren't on the internet. We must get this information out. It is a matter, literally, of life and death. Why are we here in the church? As African Americans, the Black church has often been a great center of information and collective power. We've gathered here because it is my opinion that in many ways the church failed our community during the HIV/AIDS crisis. We allowed false notions of sexuality not to talk to our community and guide our community, to give our community the best information. We cannot commit that sin again. So as we enter into Black History Month, let us briefly pray and then hear the Negro National Anthem. God, we thank you for this moment. We ask you to touch the doctors and everyone who will participate, and we ask that this information will go far and wide, that lives will be changed, vaccines will be distributed, information will be given, that no one will lose their life, nor their parents or their grandparents, because of a medical inequity. We thank you for this moment. Amen. Now, the Friendship Missionary Baptist Church Music Ministry will lead us in what is traditionally known as the Black National Anthem.
Camera one. There you go. Perfect. Turn that way. Yeah. Sorry. Go ahead.
All right. We hope that you've had a chance to share this program on your page, to text, tell, tag somebody, let them know about this critical conversation. We thought we'd do this in 3 different stages. The first will be with the medical doctors. We have invited 2 practicing physicians to come and give us the best medical advice we can get. Dr. McNeil Sells is with us. And she is a practicing physician, a pediatric physician here. And she's going to present to us, along with her colleague, and help us to understand the medical ins and outs of COVID, how it impacts communities of color, some of the historical background. I have to deal with COVID because I have had to bury loved ones. It's impacted how we can do our business as a church. And I've discovered that many of our seniors are impacted by COVID because they're coming into contact with grandchildren and children. Some of our death and our illness can be avoided if we practice CDC guidelines, if we're patient enough with each other to practice social distancing, if we keep our bubbles small, if we wash our hands, and wear our mask. I'm going to start tonight with a presentation from the doctors. Dr. McNeil Sayers and Dr. Jones will lead us in this portion. I'll turn it over to our doctors now.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Quick. We really appreciate being here with you this evening, and thank you so much for allowing us to come and share this information with the community, as well as everyone who has helped to organize this event. So as Dr. Quick stated, my name is Dr. Kedra McNeil. I am a pediatrician, and I'm also the Assistant Physician-in-Chief for Culturally Responsive Care and Inclusion at Kaiser Permanente in the Napa Solano service area. And I'm very excited to present today with my colleague, Dr. Kermit Jones, who is also a lawyer and who's the health policy advisor and an internist at Kaiser Permanente in Vacaville. And as Dr. Quick mentioned, we will be speaking with you this evening about the COVID-19 vaccine and going to answer as many questions as we can. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Jones.
Thanks a lot, Kedra. I really appreciate, and Dr. Quick, I appreciate you giving us the opportunity to join you and your congregation. This is very, very important to us. Dr. McNeil has been kind enough to recruit me in this effort because I do have a significant number of patients that sometimes having that brief conversation in the office just isn't enough to reassure them. And as you said, there's a lot of evidence out there that unfortunately Black and brown communities have been adversely affected by COVID. And right now, unfortunately, because of some of the policy failures that we've had over the last year, the vaccine really is our only way out of this pandemic. We are far too far along. The masks protect to a certain extent. Social distancing does protect, but as some of you may be aware, these new, more contagious strains are actually more contagious even if you are socially distancing. And I just want to say this before we get started. The way that the first strain was found in the UK was they looked at 2 separate communities that were socially distancing and wearing masks, and they found that by the data, one of those communities was getting an excessive number of COVID infections despite socially distancing. And by doing the genetic analysis on that strain, they found that it was highly more contagious and highly more effective at infecting people. So I want to stress that in the very beginning, and then I'll get started. So the presentation objectives today, we're just going to talk about the science and safety of the COVID-19 vaccines, describe why you really need to get the vaccine, which I already kind of talked about, and then have the question and answer phase right afterward. Next slide, please. So, some very legitimate quotes out there. I've heard this not just from patients, but from family members, from very close friends. They don't want to be first in line and they want to see some data. That they're not going to be guinea pigs again, which has happened to a lot of African Americans historically with the Tuskegee experiments and other types of situations where we just don't feel like we're being heard in the healthcare space. African Americans, there's a lot of evidence to support. You're right. We are treated differently collectively and treated differently in many individual instances by the physicians that we hold a lot of trust in. And people say that they're looking for an organization that they can trust and is not tainted by history or big pharma. And I can say, just to kind of speak to this, the healthcare system is not it's not a one-stop shop, meaning that there are hundreds of thousands of doctors, there are hundreds of thousands of nurses, and not everyone in the system is the same. So you will find people that you can trust and can't trust, but we really stress that you not have an overall distrust of the system because, the system, when it works properly, does save people's lives regardless of their ethnicity. So crucial to this is how we communicate this safety and effectiveness of the vaccine and how we instill that trust so that people really feel comfortable getting it. I got my 2 doses of the Pfizer vaccine as soon as I could. Next slide, please. So, let's talk about just basic, the vaccine production. A lot of people are concerned because it was produced so fast, right? But have you ever seen those makeover TV shows where they build a beautiful house in a week, right? So you can speed up the timeline, and they build the house over the course of the show. They didn't build it over an hour, given new resources. And in many instances, it was an old house that was kind of renovated and turned into a new house. And so with the COVID vaccine, this wasn't an old vaccine that was renovated, turned into a new vaccine, but they had processes in which you had over 100 companies working on the exact same product with a lot of evidence and a lot of things that were taken from other projects. The science that was used to produce one of the vaccines against the Ebola virus, which did take some time, and that was during the Obama administration, was similar science that was used to produce the COVID vaccine. But not a lot of people, realize that because people haven't been focusing on the Ebola vaccine. But having that science already there made it so it was they were able to tap into that and go into building this vaccine much faster. Next slide. So the $15 billion question, how can a vaccine be developed and approved so fast, right? If everyone remembers, COVID was just some type of whispering in the background in January and February of last year. And then all of a sudden in March, everything was shut down. But in this instance, the COVID virus genome was sequenced in January, and then billions of dollars was invested in resources to develop and test the vaccines through the phase 1, 2, and 3 trials. It was a shorter process. We had the science behind the mRNA vaccines, which can be produced a lot faster than the typical vaccine. This was a process that was done without cutting corners, safe and effective. The reason why I can say that confidently is I actually used to be in drug development. So with the JD and law degree that Dr. McNeil had mentioned, I worked at a law firm, and that law firm specifically focused on getting drugs and medical devices approved through the FDA. So I understand that process, and I understand looking at the data. And I can tell you very assuredly that they're not only laws that would make it so that if someone cut corners and did things illegal, they would pay 3 times the damages that the federal government would levy on them, but also there would be people that would go to prison. And while there are tons of people out there that want to make money, there are very few people out there that want to go to prison to make it. Next slide. So how do mRNA vaccines work? So they contain material from the virus that causes COVID-19, but not the actual virus. So you can't get the COVID-19 infection from the vaccine. mRNA is basically the instructions for how to make a harmless protein that is unique to the surface of the COVID-19 virus. Our cells copy the protein, then they destroy that genetic material. It's not, integrated into your DNA. You're not, turned into another person through this. Our bodies recognize the protein, shouldn't be there. And then your body's defense system, the white blood cells, the soldiers of the body, go out there and attack it. And then they memorize what that protein looks like so that they can respond to it a lot faster in the future. And that's the spike protein. Next slide. So the COVID-19 vaccine, the FDA has granted what's called an emergency use authorization for the Pfizer-BioNTech COVID-19 vaccine and the Moderna COVID-19 vaccine. Most vaccines so far have 2 doses, and that's so that your body gets that initial immune response, and then it primes it so that it gets that second immune response, which is a lot more robust than the first one. Next slide. So the 2 doses are given 14 to 20 days, 21 days apart. Both are necessary for protection. And that's because your body needs that second response to be able to produce a stronger response when it sees the real COVID virus. You shouldn't get administered any other vaccines within 14 days of getting these vaccines. So on either side, you shouldn't get another vaccine. If another non-COVID-19 vaccine is given, like I said, it should be given at least 14 days before or after. And right now it's approved for people 16 and up. Next slide. So when they look at the efficacy, what they look at is they compare one group that gets a fake version of the vaccine, and they compare another group that gets the real version, and they're randomized so that all their characteristics are as close as they can get them with respect to age and ethnicity and these other types of things within these 2 groups. And then they look at the rates of infection by constantly monitoring these groups. And what they found is the group that gets the vaccine were 95% less likely to get COVID. And then when they got the COVID, the ones that did, that 5%, in some instances, none of them got severe COVID, which is important because there are tons of people out there that have gotten COVID, but it's usually only people with certain characteristics that get COVID severe enough to put them in the hospital, put them on a ventilator, or unfortunately cause their demise. And unfortunately, as we've seen, there are certain diseases that we have a higher amount in our population because of systemic racism and these other types of things that have made it so that when we get the COVID virus, many of us suffer a lot worse than other ethnicities. Next slide. Moderna is another producer of the COVID-19 vaccine that's been approved through the EUA, which is the emergency authorization process. There are only 4 ways in which the FDA approves through that process, and that's in a state of emergency where they need to get this out as fast as they can after they've adequately looked at the data to make sure that it's safe. This one also is a 2-dose vaccine given 28 days apart to patients that are 18 and older. And again, this is something else where you should not get another vaccine within 14 days on either side of getting these vaccines. Next slide. This one also is about 94% efficacious compared to people that did not get the vaccine. And as you can see, that red line are infection cases among the vaccinated, and the blue line is infectious cases among the unvaccinated, which you see just grows and grows and grows as people are exposed to this through the community. Next slide. So side effects that people have gotten, most side effects occur within 1 and 1.5 days as your body's immune system is being stimulated. And the most common side effect is fatigue. Some people have chills and muscle pain and joint pain. I personally, when I got the first vaccine, I had arm pain for about a day. When I got the second vaccine, about 16 days later, I had a lot of fatigue and I had a headache. But that only lasted a couple of days. excuse me, and it seems as if there are fewer side effects in older age groups than younger age groups. So at least I have something telling me I'm still young at heart. And I'll turn it over to our next presenter.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, Dr. Jones. Really appreciate that information. And so essentially, just kind of reiterating some of the points that Dr. Jones has already gone through, the COVID-19 vaccines will not give you COVID-19. They do not contain any active virus. They cannot infect you. It does not cause your COVID test to turn positive either. That's another common misconception that a lot of people have, but these cannot make your COVID test turn positive. And as we've mentioned previously, the risk of death or long-term complication from a severe infection, particularly if you are someone who already has an underlying medical condition, are much, much higher compared to the risk of an adverse side effect from the COVID vaccine. Just kind of piggybacking off what Dr. Jones just mentioned with regards to the last slide where we spoke about the side effects. I actually received 2 doses of the Moderna vaccine, so opposite from what Dr. Jones received. And pretty much the same side effects. On the first day, my arm was a little bit sore for about 2-3 days. And then after I had my second shot, maybe like 24 hours after the second shot, I was very, very sore. I didn't have any headache or fever, but sore and achy with the same type of feeling like I had really worked out a lot the day before. And then that was gone within about 12 hours or so. So again, like much, much better than having a severe COVID infection that could cause you to be extremely sick for several days or weeks or hospitalized or worse. And also, as Dr. Jones mentioned, when we look back at the data from the vaccines that were studied, they were studied in very, very diverse populations. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that next. So if we look at this data table here, we can see that the Pfizer trials included over 40,000 individuals. And this was not just in the United States. These are patients from all across the world. And 30% of the patients were racially diverse, 10% were Black, 13% Hispanic or Latinx, and 5% Asian. And then there were individuals who are kind of in that middle age to older age range. When we look at the Moderna trials, there were over 25,000 people from, again, across the world who were studied, 37% racially diverse, 10% Black, 20% Hispanic, Latino, Latinx, and 4% Asian. If you were to look at prior studies and vaccines and other scientific studies that were done, this is probably one of the most diverse studies and trials that has ever been performed. Usually you have studies and trials that are done with a large amount of people, but a lot of those individuals tend to be from the same background. So whether they're kind of like Caucasian males or women or what have you, depending on the country, but this is a really good sample of different people. The other thing to consider is the fact that there were several people from different backgrounds who are participating in this whole process of developing the vaccines. You may have heard the name Dr. Kizzy Corbett, who is an NIH scientist who actually was at the helm of leading this group of researchers helping to develop the Moderna vaccine using the mRNA data that she had drawn from the studies that she had been doing with Ebola over the last several years. And so again, like this is very, very different from the things that Dr. Jones mentioned that have been done to African Americans in the past, where we basically didn't have any input, didn't have any say, didn't have any oversight, where now we're at the point where fortunately we have individuals who are right there leading the teams, leading the groups, giving a lot of oversight with the whole process. And so that I think should also help us to feel a little bit more comfortable about how things were done. And so again, and I just want to point out that these pictures that we have of individuals getting vaccinated, these are our colleagues. So this is Dr. Tanisha Silas-Young, who is the chair of women's health at Kaiser Permanente in Vacaville. The prior slide that showed an individual was our chief of hospital medicine in Vacaville, Dr. Albert Stevens. So we really wanted to make sure that we showed everyone that, you know, our African-American physicians are behind this, and we want to make sure that our community has this information so that we're protected. So again, the vaccines protect the person from who is being vaccinated against COVID. However, we don't yet know if the person who's vaccinated may still be a carrier. So for example, even though I know that I'm protected from getting a COVID infection myself, I may inadvertently come into contact with a patient or with someone else who has COVID, and the virus may live on me, but not actually infect me. And so therefore I might take that home and possibly infect my family members if I'm not taking precautions when I'm outside of my home. So that's why we tell everyone, even after you receive your vaccine, to still make sure that you're wearing your mask, make sure that you are socially distancing, and make sure that you're washing your hands frequently. Of course, when we're in our medical setting, we've got all those precautions in place. We've got our gowns, we've got our gloves, we've got our masks, our face shields, et cetera. So it's actually less likely for me to contract something from a patient versus if I'm kind of letting my guard down out and about in public and not kind of following those same guidelines. So there are some special groups for consideration with regards to the vaccine. We gave you those age groups who are eligible, but what about other individuals? For example, people who are pregnant, people who are breastfeeding, those who are immunocompromised, et cetera. So for all of these individuals, there's still ongoing studies that are being done to determine whether or not it's 100% safe. And so for that reason, we say that anyone who falls into these categories really have a good discussion with your doctor with regards to whether or not getting the vaccine is going to be the best decision for you. For the most part, unless you have, there are very few exceptions that are kind of like a hard, fast, definitely do not get the vaccine. But if you're in one of these high risk groups, especially, if you're pregnant or breastfeeding, or if your immune system is compromised because you're, on chemotherapy, a cancer patient, whatever the case may be, we still do recommend getting the vaccine because, as we stated previously, getting the vaccine and being protected against actually being infected from COVID is a much lower risk than actually getting COVID and then potentially ending up very, very sick in the hospital, particularly, again, if you're in one of these high risk groups. So this is what we call the shared decision-making process, where you talk about this with your physician and decide if this is going to be the best thing for you. What are some of those side effects for people who end up not necessarily passing away, but maybe either end up in the hospital or sick for weeks at a time? So when we look at the data, what we know thus far, like in the last year approximately, many people are going to experience mild symptoms or moderate illness. So about 10 to 15% of people who are infected with COVID will progress to a more severe disease, and about 5% of those people become critically ill. So those are the patients who are in the intensive care unit, on the ventilators, unable to breathe on their own, et cetera. Most people, of course, are not going to be hospitalized, but you may still be sick for anywhere from 2 to 6 weeks. And even after that 2 to 6 week time frame, you may not 100% recover. So there are people who are living now with what is being called long hauler syndrome, where they may still have joint pain, they may still have body aches, they may not be able to taste or smell anymore. And so they still are not quite back to their 100%, even though they're past kind of the major acute phase of their illness and they're no longer contagious. So again, this is a very serious disease that we're dealing with, and we're still learning a lot about it as time goes on. So looking at the racial disparities that we know are present with COVID-19. So according to the Centers for Disease Control, African Americans are 3 times more likely to get infected compared to our white counterparts, and 2 times more likely to actually die from the infection. When we look at our Latinx counterparts, they're 2.5 times more likely to pass away from COVID compared to white patients. And when we look at that disparity, it's actually higher in younger age groups. So when we look at the patients who are actually being hospitalized and passing away, and we look at patients of color, typically those are patients from their mid-40s to their mid-60s, as compared to the Caucasian patients passing away tend to be much, much older. So we saw this huge wave of people passing away like in their 70s, 80s, et cetera, when the pandemic first began. But what we're seeing now, the hospitals are actually not being filled with people who are very elderly, but they're being filled with people who are, essentially middle-aged to 60s. And so again, those disparities are very, very prominent. So, we still have to make sure, even if you're in that middle age to younger group, you still have to make sure to protect yourself from getting infected. And again, this is just a table that kind of talks about, essentially goes over some of those same data points that we just discussed with regards to African Americans, Asians, Native Americans being at higher risk for hospitalization, for infection, as well as for death. And so why is it that these disparities take place? Well, there are multiple reasons, and Dr. Jones already mentioned some of those. Of course, systemic racism, inequities in the medical system overall, and health disparities that kind of are born from those facts, but also looking at kind of these data points and looking at the facts that individuals who are minorities are also more likely to be in a position where they're an essential worker. And so they don't have the luxury of working from home. And so just by virtue of the fact that they have to go out and go to work and be exposed to other people outside of their household, that is a risk factor in itself. People who are in minority groups are also more likely to live in multi-generational households. And so you may have, the middle-aged person or the 20-something person going out to work and then coming home, and there may be a grandparent or another elderly family member at home who's then exposed to that person who's going outside of the household. And then, as we said before, of course, the disease burden for chronic diseases such as diabetes, high blood pressure, et cetera, are also higher in minority communities. And I would really just challenge everyone to think, especially if you're African American and you're listening, how many people can you name just off the top of your head that you know with either hypertension or diabetes, whether they are close friends or family members? And I'm quite sure that everyone can very easily name at least one person, if not more than one person. And so how is it that we kind of, again, look at the mistrust that we were talking about previously with the population? So there were several focus groups that were performed towards the end of last year in collaboration with the NAACP and several other groups. And so we can see that mistrust and that feeling discomfort with wanting to receive the vaccine is much lower for African American patients and Latinx patients. So when we look at the little bubbles here in our table, we can see that only 14% of African Americans at the time of survey felt that they trusted the vaccines were safe, as compared to 34% of individuals who were Latinx, feeling that it was effective, 18% for African Americans, 40% Latinx, and then trust in testing or safety that was culturally specific. So just over a quarter of African Americans and just a little bit less than half of Latinx individuals. And there's some reports that just came out recently that you may have seen, just kind of looking at who has received the vaccine thus far throughout the state and across the country. And you can see these figures very easily on the CDC's website or on the California Department of Health website. But at this point in time, less than 5% of the vaccines that have been administered across the country have been given to African Americans. And so some may look at that as, feeling really uncomfortable or feeling, well, this isn't working, but I really choose to look at it as an opportunity. And I think I can say that Dr. Jones probably can say the same thing, because what we're doing right now gives us a chance to connect, to dialogue, to give people a chance to ask questions, because there are a lot of questions to be answered, and then hopefully help people feel more comfortable in making that very personal decision to protect themselves. And so what if you're not quite there yet? That's okay. This is it. Like I said, this is a very, very personal decision. I'll share that I wasn't one of the first people in line to get it. I really had to do some research. I had to speak with some of my colleagues. I had to, speak with family members and just get to a point to where I felt very comfortable and that I felt I was making the right decision in getting it. And so again, we hope that everyone does get to that point. But if you're not at that point, like today, right at this minute, that's okay, because we still have time to continue to learn, especially if you really continue to protect yourself. And so, as we said, getting that vaccine should be a shared decision between yourself. Talk with your regular doctor if you have questions. And for those of you who are Kaiser Permanente patients, we have a lot of information that is available on our website. So if you go to kpdoc.org/COVID-19 vaccine info, and that's kind of a mouthful, but feel free to take a screenshot, take a picture with your phone so you can go straight to that website. And if you're not a Kaiser Permanente member, again, you can check the resources that are available on the county websites to see, what is the latest information with regards to vaccination sites or questions or, other frequently asked concerns that are there. And again, use your regular doctor as a resource so that you can make sure to get those questions answered. So some of the key takeaways that we really want to make sure that everyone leaves this evening with include that both of the vaccines that are currently approved, the Pfizer and the Moderna, are very effective, over 94% effective, and they were developed quickly and safely. You cannot get COVID-19 from either of these vaccines, and the risk of long-term complications or side effects or death from a COVID-19 infection far outweigh the risks that exist for side effects from actually getting the vaccines. And getting vaccinated has been shown to protect you. And in the meantime, we really implore everyone to please continue to wear your mask, continue to socially distance, and to wash those hands either with soap and water or with hand sanitizer if you don't have soap and water readily available. And so with that, again, just a few resources, a little bit bigger for you. So we've got our website there, and you don't even have to be a Kaiser member to look at our website. Anyone can look on there. You don't need to log on or anything like that. So there's lots of really great information there, and in multiple languages too. You can feel free to text the word COVID in all caps to 45356. There is a specific resource page that we created that I actually had a hand in creating with our regional team specifically for communities of color. So we have a video featuring Dr. Jones and another one of our colleagues, African-American colleagues, Dr. Cassandra Whitmore, really going into COVID-19 frequently asked questions more in detail. And there's also a photo story that we have featuring a family kind of mulling over the decision whether or not they're going to travel to a big family event. And again, here's the website for the California Department of Public Health. And the CDPH also has a COVID tracker. So you can log on to this COVID tracker and it's updated on a daily basis to tell you how many cases are in the state, how many vaccines have been given. They break down the ethnicity. So there's a lot of really great data and a resource there for you to learn from. And so with that, we will take any questions, please.
We're going to ask the two doctors to take down their presentation and pull up their pictures so that the people can see who they are. And I want to thank them first for their presentation. The questions are being compiled now. They are amazing questions. I want to accentuate a couple of things before we go into the Q&A. First, I want to point out that both of the physicians explained to us that African Americans were highly represented in the studies. Represented, I believe I heard you say, at larger numbers than in most studies.
Correct.
Okay, so if you have been told they didn't test on Black people, that is not true. Both of these drugs had an ample sample, I rhymed, of African Americans and Latinx people. The second thing that's important, our older Americans, our older African Americans are contracting COVID because they are coming into contact with family members. The CDC has today or yesterday said that the largest spreaders of COVID are between the ages of 20 and 49. And that means young people are still going out, we're still hanging out, we're coming home, and we're killing our ancestors. If you love your family, you will not go out, act in a risky manner, and then come home and bring it to grandma and auntie and them. So tonight, in part, I really want to express that we have some power in keeping our families alive. And I want us to use that power. Lastly, for all of you who are on the line tonight, but you know a senior who doesn't use Facebook, not on YouTube, they don't really use the internet. We have 1,100 families associated with this church. Many of them are not on technology. I need you to call 10, 15 seniors. I need you to call them as your way of loving Black people, as your way of saying Black and brown lives matter. I need you to become evangelists for helping the seniors in our community learn about this vaccine and get involved in this. So I just wanted to reiterate that. The last thing I wanted to say was, I hear a lot of conversation about the Tuskegee experiment and Henrietta Lacks And we all know the history of medicine in the Western Hemisphere, whether it's gynecological research done on black women. We all know that this is real, it's true. We're not denying that there is medical racism. And yet, that's not the time we're in. We have doctors like you and doctors like Dr. Jones. Many of those things occurred because black people weren't in the room at the time. Can you just, as a doctor, talk about how you see the medical situation within a healthcare system? Do you see reasons for us to be in obscene fear now? How should we talk to our families, especially older Americans, who are afraid of medical racism and think this is a plan that Bill Gates wants to put chips in our arms and all that kind of stuff? As black doctors, what would you say to our community to help them understand that this is not something they should be afraid of?
This is Dr. Jones. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I would first say that those Microsoft chips, they don't really work. So you don't have to worry about them anyway. When they get put in your arm, Microsoft doesn't really work anyway. No, so I agree with the Reverend. There's a long history that I think a lot of people draw from, and especially the older people. I can definitely relate to that, in talking to my parents as well. But what I try to emphasize with my patients are that we are in a different era. We're not in an era where everything is perfect. I mean, if that were the case, we wouldn't have had, certain events happen from 2016 to 2020. But we are in an era where we had the first black president elected twice in this country. We now have the first African-American woman vice president. So, and I don't say that again to say that there are no problems or that racism doesn't exist, but I say that the context of the Tuskegee experiments, the context of a lot of these other really unfortunate things that happened in our community happened within a broader societal matrix, so to speak, in terms of racism, things on those lines. The Tuskegee experiments happened also at a time where a lot of African Americans, were still living under certain aspects of Jim Crow, and weren't able to vote in the same amount that they were able to vote now in the same numbers. And, lynchers were higher, and lynching rather was higher, and these other things happened. So, those types of things are far less likely to happen today because we have, luckily, more political power, more economic power, more representation, and more awareness, and more people that understand, what we should be doing as a country and trying to live up to our ideals. So that's what I wanted to emphasize, kind of following on what Dr. Quick was saying was, like I said before, I got the vaccine. I felt comfortable getting it, even though I understand the discomfort, but I also understand, looking at the numbers, how, I want to be around for my kids. I want to be around for my wife, and I don't want to, unfortunately, end up a person that thought he was going to be just fine getting COVID and then ends up, in a bad situation.
Thank you, Dr. Jones. We have our dear sister Lisa Jackson here. She's also a social worker and department head at Kaiser. She's going to be helping us with Dr. Bishop, who is not on screen, compile the questions from people who've been watching. We have several questions. So Sister Lisa is going to ask the doctors the first questions.
Good evening, everyone. The first question is, how can seniors who do not have email register for vaccination? I'll repeat that in case you didn't hear it.
we'll probably, we're going to get to Supervisor Hannigan, who's going to help us with all of you who have questions about process.
Okay.
We want to deal with questions first about pre-existing conditions. I know there are a number of people who have questions about pre-existing conditions, that kind of thing. And while she gets those, let me ask one that I know I saw as well. If a person has diabetes, heart disease, and a number of other pre-existing conditions, should they be worried about taking the COVID vaccine?
So I'll go ahead and take that one. So basically, with regards to someone who has multiple pre-existing conditions, heart disease, diabetes, hypertension, et cetera. So this is someone who should be very worried about contracting COVID-19. And so for that reason, this is someone who should definitely try to receive the COVID vaccine as soon as possible in order to make sure that they are protected, because we know that having even one of those risk factors, no less multiple risk factors on top of each other, is really going to exponentially increase that person's risk of having very severe disease, being hospitalized, and possibly dying.
Dr. McNeil, along those same lines, what are the side effects for those with compromised immune systems? For example, with chronic asthmatics, should they be concerned about having any additional side effects than those that you've already talked about?
I'll take that one. So there is conflicting evidence about whether having asthma will make it more or less likely that you end up with a severe COVID. There are some studies that said it did slightly increase your risk, and oddly enough, some studies that said that it didn't. But I can tell you from, I guess, my perspective as an internal medicine physician, you really don't want to have anything infectious-wise that kind of causes your immune system to over-respond and then cause some of the wheezing and other types of issues. So I haven't seen any evidence that asthma itself increases your risk of having any side effects from the COVID vaccine. But I would say, any types of respiratory chronic conditions, given that this primarily is a respiratory infection that has, multiple side effects that, can involve damage to your heart, increased risk of blood clots. Unfortunately, we had a colleague whose dad just passed away of COVID. And the way that he eventually died, he was suffering with it for a couple of weeks in the hospital, was he had, it killed part of his bowel, so his small intestines and large intestines was kind of destroyed by it. So unfortunately, the virus itself, and they've shown some risk of increased neurological issues, causes so many different things to our body that it's just, again, one of these things that the vaccine tends to be the best way to go.
Is there anything in addition that individuals with autoimmune disorders should be considering?
Dr. Jones, I'm going to let you take that one.
Okay, sure. Yeah, so interestingly enough, I have had a conversation with a couple of specialists because I have had some patients that are on immunosuppressants that want to take the vaccine. And, there are honestly different approaches. There's some doctors so high level, even people with compromised immune systems are recommending that they get the vaccine. The question is whether they should stop their immunosuppressants for a certain period of time before and after, or whether they should just continue through them. And I've actually seen, two separate approaches. I've seen some specialists that are recommending holding your immunosuppressants for a week before and a week after, so your immune system can respond based upon what your immunosuppressant is suppressing. For very severe illnesses, like if you're suppressing something that's attacking your brain because your immune system's doing that, attacking your ability to breathe. I just had a conversation with a pulmonologist earlier today in which he said, no, he's actually recommending to his patients that they continue their immunosuppressants because in that instance, he felt the risk of their being off of them was higher than stopping them. So I would say, for those of you that are on immunosuppressants, you should reach out to your doctor. You should reach out to the specialist that put you on those medicines and see what their specialty societies are telling them and the guidance that they're having. But still, I've not heard one of them say that you should not get the vaccine. It's just depending upon how they may adjust your medications around it.
I have a quick question, and there's conflicting news about COVID and children and young people. I have a 16-year-old, and there are some parents who I've talked to that don't believe this really impacts kids. Is that accurate? Are our children at risk for getting sick? And maybe there's a sense that the younger you are, you can get sick, not even know it, you won't die. How do we deal with those preconceptions around COVID and youth?
Thank you for asking that. Okay, I'm a pediatrician, as I said, so this one is up my alley. So to answer kind of the foundation of the question, so what we have learned at this point in time and what we've suspected from the very beginning is that younger children do not typically get as severe infections as adults and older individuals because of the fact that the receptors in their system, in their respiratory tract, actually the virus cannot bind to those receptors in the same way that it does for adults, and even in teenagers. And so for that reason, fortunately, we've not seen such severe cases and the extremely high number of deaths in pediatric patients that we've seen in adults. It doesn't, of course, mean that children cannot get infected. Children can and do get infected. I've seen multiple children and teenagers with COVID infections throughout the course of this past year. Typically, for children who are 10 and under, they may have very few symptoms or they may have no symptoms at all. Typically, for children who are over the age of 13, their bodies tend to respond a little bit more in an adult manner. And so those are usually the patients that I'm seeing who tend to be more sick with fever, chills, respiratory infections, et cetera. The number of children who are hospitalized is exponentially lower compared to those adults who are hospitalized, which again is a good thing for the pediatric population. But typically when children are hospitalized, it tends to be because of really severe respiratory issues. And then there's also something that's unique to kids when they get infected is they tend to have more stomach issues, especially younger children will have more nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, stomach pain compared to older kids, teenagers, and adults. And because of that fact, again, that kids tend to be less symptomatic or completely without symptoms, it is something that we've seen, kids pass along from one household to another or, from playmates from another household because of the fact that they just didn't even know that the child was infected. And so it's still important even for kids to continue those measures that we talked about, making sure they're wearing their masks, making sure that they're washing their hands, that they're physically distancing and minimizing contact between people who are outside of their household because kids can get infected and they can spread the virus, though fortunately just not as severe as adults.
What about people who take a lot of medicine? And along that same line, what about those on blood thinners? Can INR levels be affected?
Well, what can happen with the COVID virus and infection is it can cause your immune system, or rather your coagulation system, to be completely out of whack. And so in some instances, people can get blood clots, some people can get uncontrolled bleeding and inflammation. And so that's why in many instances, there have been some studies that looked at whether putting people on aspirin that get COVID lowers their risk of, having these types of adverse issues. I just wanted to make sure, if you're asking whether the COVID vaccine has caused any issues with INR levels, I haven't seen any data to suggest that. But the COVID infection itself can cause an overreaction to even your clotting system that can result in people having abnormal blood clots and dying from those.
Dr. McNeil, let me ask you a question about parents and schools, because I'm often asked about should I send my child to school? Based upon what you just said, it seems to me that if I send my child to school and my child comes into contact with another child and they both end up with COVID, they could come back home with no real symptoms, and then adults in the house can end up with that. How do we understand, because many of us, I was confronted with the decision about whether to do hybrid, 2 days a week. We chose not. But how do we as parents navigate this issue of COVID, our children, and not bringing an infection into our house?
No, that's a great question, Dr. Quick. Thank you for asking that. And this is a question that I've spoken about with parents over the last year multiple times, question that we've wrestled with in our own household because we have a 5 and a 7-year-old as well. So essentially, there's not really an easy answer to that question. We've seen so much data from across the country that has shown, unfortunately, the negative effects of children not being able to be within their school environment. Excuse me, from a social standpoint, from an emotional standpoint, from an educational standpoint, particularly for children who have special needs or, who need additional assistance with their learning. So there's been a really, really big impact kind of across all ages, all grades, et cetera, with not being in school. Now, of course, with those kids being at home, they're not necessarily exposed to other classmates who may give them COVID, but then there are other effects that may go along with that. Now, thus said, if the school is able to provide an environment that is, basically safe, that is stable, where, they have those precautions firmly in place, and the children are able to be physically distanced, the children are, in cohorts or what have you, so smaller size classes or breaking them up into groups or what have you. Children are wearing masks, they're washing hands, then it has been shown that kids who are in those environments are much less likely to contract COVID even than the kids who are at home. Because of course, when the kids are at home, then they're still getting together with other friends or family members or what have you. And then kind of like we said, they're getting COVID from their family as opposed to getting it from classmates at school. And of course, we do know that unfortunately the schools themselves, even pre-COVID, had a lot of issues with resources and being able to kind of provide the fundamentals. So the question is really on the table: how do schools across the country provide that adequate, safe environment for children to be able to return back safely? And we actually had the option of either kind of doing like all virtual or all in class for my daughter's school. And we decided after a little bit of virtual schooling, with all the precautions in place and kind of all of those parameters set, that we felt comfortable with them going back. So my daughters have been back physically in school, but again, with all of those things in place. So school looks a lot different than it did pre-COVID, but they are in school on a regular basis right now.
Thank you, Dr. McNeil. One last question, and that is, what about heart transplant patients? Should they be concerned about anything in particular?
Yeah, I think this goes back to that conversation about immunosuppressants, because all of the transplant patients are going to be on chronic immunosuppressants. And they also have had previous trauma. The surgical procedure itself is a traumatic experience to go through. So this would, again, be a population that they would have to talk to their provider, their transplant provider, their the cardiologist, about whether they should get the vaccine or not. But it's more likely than not that they would probably need to get the vaccine and just have the conversation about what to do about the immunosuppressants. Because, the unfortunate thing is individual like that has already gone through a situation where they needed a brand new heart. And we know how hard those are to come by. So that's definitely not, one, they're going to be at higher risk. And then two, that's not something that they're going to want to jeopardize. And we have seen that COVID can and frequently does infect hearts as well and cause a lot of serious problems with that.
I wanted to just ask one general question because I hear it coming up all the time, and that is about the difference between the two vaccines. And I think I heard both of you say one took Moderna and one took Pfizer, right? Which is great. So a number of people have said, does it matter which one I take? Is one more effective than the other? And then there is the introduction of this Johnson & Johnson 1 dose. And some people say, I just want to wait for the 1 dose. So can you talk about, are there any practical differences between the two? And do you risk something by waiting for Johnson & Johnson? How do we understand the differences in these vaccines so that we can have an intelligent conversation with our community about them?
So maybe we can kind of split this one up a little bit. So Dr. Jones, I can take kind of the first part about the difference between the two if you want to speak on Johnson & Johnson. That work? Okay, perfect. Because I'm sure you've researched it. So with regards to whether or not there's a difference between the two, just essentially fundamentally with regards to how they were developed, how they were created, kind of all the research and the science that goes into them. Not really. I mean, they're both, mRNA based, as we said. If we go back to those graphs that we showed earlier, where you could see the efficacy, I want to say that Pfizer was 95% effective at preventing an actual COVID infection in those participants, and the Moderna was 94% effective. So again, pretty much the same efficacy. And so, and then also the side effect profile, again, pretty much the same side effect profile. One of the main, I think, fundamental differences is that the Pfizer vaccine is given with the second dose 21 days after the first, whereas the Moderna vaccine is given approximately 28 days after the first dose, second dose given 28 days after the first dose. And so those are really kind of some of the basic differences between the two. But I mean, the main thing that we're concerned about is how well do they work, and what side effects do they cause. And so with that, they pretty much mirror each other. And sometimes people say, well, even kind of a segue to the question about, well, should I wait for the Johnson & Johnson, the 1 dose, or should I wait for, can I request Moderna versus Pfizer, what have you? It really is going to depend on what's available when you go in to receive the vaccine. So the states receive a certain supply, and then they allocate that supply to the counties and to the hospitals, et cetera. And so then you may go in one day and they're doing Pfizer. You may go in another day and they're doing Moderna. That's basically what happened to me when I went in. They were doing Moderna that day. And the Pfizer that they did have, they were actually saving that for second doses that were coming up the following week to make sure that they wouldn't run out. Because again, they're finding out on a weekly basis what they're going to be receiving from the county and from the state. And so that pretty much kind of covers that portion. So Dr. Jones, I'll let you speak on the Johnson & Johnson vaccine.
First, I have to figure out how to stop muting myself. Yeah, so I would say, so to answer the question, I don't think you should wait. And that's because, like I said, these mutant versions of the virus, and all viruses mutate. Unfortunately, the reason why we're seeing these mutations here is because this virus is so widespread. The more prevalent the virus is, the more likely the virus is going to figure out ways to mutate and then figure out ways to evade our defense systems. So the longer you wait, actually, the more likely that you're going to get infected with something that's more contagious, and we don't know, maybe even worse. Waiting for the Johnson & Johnson one is also not a good idea, because I haven't been able to find any evidence so far of its overall efficacy, and that's kind of weird. So, I have not said anything negative that I could see about any of the vaccines in general, but the first thing that I noticed about the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is they didn't lead with information about its overall efficacy. They led with information about its ability to stop moderate and severe disease. And the reason why that's important, I mean, you definitely don't want to get moderate and severe disease, But even those numbers weren't as high as we saw with the Pfizer and the Moderna vaccine. And part of that could have been that part of the data came out of South Africa, where one of the mutants is a lot more prevalent than it is here. And part of it could be that they actually, don't want to share that data in terms of how well, because it's probably not as good. So I would say that if you wait, you increase your risk of getting infected with something that may be worse. And then if you wait for the Johnson & Johnson one, just because, it's this one dose one, you may get something that's less effective in protecting yourself and protecting the people around you.
Excellent. Thank you all so much. We're going to ask, if you can, to hang out with us for just a little bit more, if you're available for that. I know one of you are at the office and you have kids. We're going to do a little shift, but they're all connected. Part of what we want to make sure of is because we know a lot of you are caretakers. You're taking care of parents. Some of you are seniors. Margot on YouTube has expressed a frustration about access here in the county. And I know some of you have contacted me because there are churches in Oakland and other places that have been vaccine and testing sites. And so I'm pleased that we have Supervisor Hannigan here with us today, because when you call me, I find somebody that I can call and say, okay, what's going on? And to give my frustrations to. And so she's gotten a few of my frustrating phone calls. And we're also happy that Lisa Jackson is here. So we're shifting to part of our second part of this, and that is, how do I get a shot if I want one? How do I prepare myself and my family for this? How do I interact with the healthcare system? The practical questions, now that you are armed with information, now that you know that Black and brown communities are dying at higher numbers, and reports are showing that white Americans are getting vaccinated at 2 to 3 times higher rates than Black and brown people. So that if Black lives matter, we're not getting vaccinated at the same rates. We're dying at higher numbers. So I think we want to start with some of the interpersonal family systems. How do you navigate around hospitals, living wills, and that type of thing? Then we're going to move to Supervisor Hannigan, and we're going to get really in the weeds about how here in Solano County, where can you get vaccinated? Where do we sign up? All those kind of things. Sister Lisa, why don't you start us off?
Good evening again. As Pastor just said, I'm Lisa Jackson, and I am the social work manager for Kaiser Permanente Home Health, Hospice, Bereavement, Spiritual Care, and Social Work Internship Program for the Napa-Solano service area. It is an absolute honor and pleasure to have the opportunity to speak with you for a couple of minutes about 2 really important things you need to know as it relates to your health care. Next screen. I'd like to talk a little bit about our hospital without walls. So for those of you who are caregivers, and for yourself, if you become sick or, God forbid, come down with COVID-19, you know from past experience and from current experience with family and friends that it is rare, unless you are really, really sick, that you will stay in the hospital. Most likely you will be discharged home on home health. And home health and hospice are our hospitals without walls. So I will talk a little bit about that, the role of the medical social worker, who can speak on your behalf when you're unable to, and advanced healthcare directives. Next screen. As I said, home health and hospice healthcare teams bring the hospital to you. Your care team is comprised of doctors, nurses, social workers, therapists, and chaplains who are charged to do many things, including address your biopsychosocial and spiritual needs, identify your goals of care, assure your patient rights are upheld, help you make difficult decisions, such as whether or not to get the COVID vaccination. Next screen. They are also there to support you in establishing a new normal after sustaining an injury, receiving a terminal diagnosis, or losing a loved one. Identify effective ways for you to cope with your current situation or new reality. help your family resolve conflicts, and if on hospice, we also help you learn how to live while dying. Next screen. The role of home health and hospice social workers. So I have a team of professional level medical social workers who provide the following services: crisis intervention, counseling, advocacy, reducing and removing barriers to accessing benefits and services, such as COVID vaccinations, assisting with navigating internal hospital systems and government agencies, and making referrals to community resources. Next screen. Benefits of having a social worker on your medical team. Social workers are your advocates and your liaisons. Your social worker can successfully advocate on your behalf under two conditions, and two conditions only. One is per your request as a patient, and the other is when you as a patient are unable to use your voice, such as for those patients who are seriously ill due to the COVID-19 virus. Your social worker is also your liaison between your healthcare team, the hospital, and the community. Next screen. Who else can speak on your behalf? Other people who can speak on your behalf when you cannot speak for yourself is your surrogate decision maker. And in California, that person is deemed to be whomever you know best. So for all of you mothers out there who want to be your baby's surrogate decision maker, whether your baby is 16 or 69, you may not get that opportunity here in California based on law. The other person who is able to speak on your behalf is your durable power of attorney. And that person is established through legal documentation for healthcare and finances. So there are two durable power of attorneys, one for healthcare and one for finances. That can be one person in the same, or it can be two different people. And you can have alternate durable DPOAs, as we call them. The other person who can operate on your behalf is your conservator, and that is someone who is appointed by the court of law. Next screen. The Advanced Healthcare Directive. This allows you to share your values, your choices, and your instructions about your health care. It must be witnessed or notarized and can be used to name a healthcare agent, which is someone you trust to carry out your medical wishes and make difficult healthcare decisions for you in the event you cannot speak for yourself. Or it can be used to provide written instructions about your health care, or it can be used for both, to name a healthcare agent and to provide written instructions for healthcare. The brochure that you see in this slide is what you will see if you are a Kaiser member and your doctor speaks with you about your Advanced Healthcare Directive. Next slide. When should I complete a healthcare directive? So at the age that you become an adult, at age 18 and older. If you already have an advanced directive, then be sure to review and update it whenever you have a change in medical condition. If you do not have an advanced directive, then please talk with your doctor about completing one as soon as possible. If you have a living trust, then you may not realize it, but you have already completed your advanced directive. Next screen. So that ends my presentation. What I would like to say is that one of the many things that we often come across in working in home health and hospice is that we have patients every day who do not have their advanced healthcare directive. That not only puts the patient in further distress, but it also puts the family in further distress. It causes increased family conflict, and it can complicate grief. So I implore you to use your social worker if one is on your team or one is on the team of a loved one with whom you're supporting. If you don't have one, ask for one. That is your right. And also complete your advanced healthcare directive, wear your mask, keep social distance, stay safe, and thank you.
And she's going to be around because we're going to do a round of questions. I know one that I'm going to have is what happens if you have COVID, and the doctor's going to have to participate on this one too. And they say go home, and you got to ride it out. What are some of the best ways to ride it out at home? But before we get there, the reason it was important to have Lisa Jackson give her presentation is many of you are taking care of parents. You have developed a frustration if somebody's sick, you can't go to the hospital and see them right now. You're having to FaceTime your loved ones. Helping you to navigate that system should be the chaplain, the social service worker, people like that. Now, the last big bulk of information we need comes from Supervisor Hannigan. Many of our seniors have been trying to figure out, if I want a shot, where do I go get one? If I go to Kaiser, they say they don't have one. If I'm not a Kaiser member, where do I go then? All these questions are coming up, and now we're going to go to Supervisor Hannigan, who's going to help us navigate. How do we go to the next level? Now that we've gotten the good information, what do we do with it? Supervisor Hannigan.
Great. Thank you, Pastor Quick. I appreciate your invite to this forum and to be a part of it. It's so important for us to get accurate information out to the public, and it is one of those things I've been trying to do this last entire year. Where to go for a vaccine? I'm going to start by just saying to everybody that's watching, please be patient. I know a lot of you are excited about getting a vaccine, and there certainly are places where that can happen, and I'm going to share a few that are coming up. But there are challenges with supply. There are challenges with all the organizations that are actually receiving vaccine on what's the best way to get it out. And so we are doing, I can tell you from the county's perspective, we're putting every dose we receive into an arm because it's that important for us. So what I would like to drive everybody to is our SolanoCounty.com website. We've had a COVID link on our website that could tell you all information that you want to know about the virus itself in terms of where we are in our county, numbers of folks who have been positive, who have survived, who have unfortunately have passed away, and also it breaks out the demographic information in regards to ethnicity on all of those statistics. But we also now have what is, it's called our vaccine site, and I'm looking at my paper here, and it's at, like I said, SolanoCounty.com. The vaccination link, it's a blue button on the page, and it takes you to our vaccine web page. And on that page in the middle is a box that you can sign up to say that you are interested in getting the vaccine. There's some pointed questions that will be asked in terms of age, are you your type of work, are you essential worker, and all of that is really to determine where, based on the CDPH guidelines, you come into being eligible to get the vaccine. So where are we today? On that site, it'll also tell you where we are in terms of essential workers. But for the general public, we are currently vaccinating those people in our community who are 75 years and older. And so that is our target. We've had several clinics, vaccine clinics throughout the county. We had one out in Rio Vista at Trilogy. We had one on Monday in Benicia. Actually, it was Wednesday in Benicia. Both of those had 1,500 recipients receive the vaccine. And then starting tomorrow morning at 9 a.m., we're going to have a mass vaccination site at the Solano County Fairgrounds in Vallejo. And that site is going to run both Friday and Saturday, and we have 3,500 doses available to people who are looking for the vaccine. You can sign up for the vaccine for tomorrow and for Saturday by going to the Friendship Missionary Baptist Church Facebook page and also their web page. They have the tiny URL login, and you can go in and set up for a vaccine. I've already heard that there is a concern in terms of the form itself, that it does require an email address, and if you don't have one, it kind of forces you to put one there. Again, I'll go back to my first statement, and that is be patient. A lot of what is being created, not just in Solano County, but in counties throughout California, we are doing it individually and on our own. As you recall, for the last year, we have not had a federal administration that would support reduction of the COVID transmission, and then that all fell into the situation with the vaccine itself. So, that's why this page has this issue, and I'm told, and this is true, that you can put in this this email address, supervisorjoe@email.com, and I am not kidding, that is the workaround. Otherwise, you can also call in to our office, and that is 707-784-8655. Again, all of this is on the vaccine webpage, so you can find that information there. We know that our folks in our communities that are 75 years of age or older may not have access to the internet. It may be a confusing process. So I would, Dr. Quick, I want to call you Dr. Quick, Pastor Quick, said this in his statement also, and that was, you know, let's help our seniors get in and signed up and to the vaccination sites. And so if you could do that, that would be wonderful. But like I said, if you can call the number 707-784-8655, we can get you a slot if you're 75 years or older, or you fall into the tier of essential workforce that are being vaccinated at this moment. I'm open for questions, but I think one of the interesting issues about the vaccine itself is it's coming into our county from a number of different avenues. One is through the hospitals, as we call our multi-county entities. Kaiser and Sutter have hospitals in other counties, and they're receiving quantities of vaccine to deliver to their workforce, but also to their patients. And then we also have another delivery system, and that is through our pharmacies, CVS, Walgreens, Rite Aid. We've had some great information just today through the governor's office, and you can find this on the CDPH, and that is that here in Solano County, we're going to have, and also throughout the state, Optum Serve, which might be a familiar name. These are the testing sites. They are going to be offering vaccines as well as Safeway stores across the county. And I know there's going to be 2 in Vallejo at Admiral Callahan and Robles, the one in on Glen Cove will be offering vaccinations as well. And so there are going to be a number of ways to get the vaccine. And like the doctors said, and I completely agree, do not wait. Do not wait for it to come to you. If you can get to the vaccination sites, that would be in your best interest, and that would be what we would prefer. We will be opening up to 65 and plus probably in the next week or so. We're looking, just to see what the demand is at 75 plus, and then we'll be opening up the additional capacity for those individuals. Questions I receive are, when are we going to go from the purple tier to the red tier in terms of the impact of the virus in our community? And I can tell you today we are still in the purple tier, but according to our public health officer, Dr. Bela Matias, our positive rate is decreasing pretty rapidly. Shortly after the holiday season, as well as the new year, we had spikes in some weeks and some days, over 500 cases, positive cases tested just in our county per day. And actually today we were told that we are down to a 14.5% positivity rate. Currently in our county, we have 11,071 active cases. We have tested, these are some great numbers, 201,000 unique individuals in our county, and we have administered 256,000 tests total. Right now, we have 104 residents are hospitalized. Our availability in our ICUs is good at about 29%. So some of back to the tiering of where we are in terms of the virus, people ask, when are we going to be able to open schools? When am I going to go and be able to sit in a restaurant and eat? We would need to have less than 30 positive cases per day for 3 weeks to be able to move from the purple tier to the red tier. However, schools will be able to open when we get below 100 positive cases per day, and that is sustained for 2 weeks. And we could open TK and up to 6th grade in terms of those age groups. In total, as far as in terms of vaccinations that have been administered throughout the county, we've got 36,300 total shots, and that's first and second shots. And of those 36,000, almost 30,000 have received their first dose, and a majority of them will be receiving their second dose in the next 2 weeks. So we are moving along our continuing of vaccinating people in our community, but we want to make sure that everybody has a chance and access to the vaccine, which is why I've shared with Friendship Missionary Baptist Church and others throughout our community about the openings that we have for vaccines tomorrow and Saturday at the fairgrounds. And with that, I can take any questions.
I think it's important tomorrow.
Tomorrow.
And we've posted on the Facebook post the phone number and the link. This is what I need you to do. If you know somebody in your family, in your neighborhood, at your church, I need you to call an older person who is 70, 75. Call them tonight. Give them that phone number. As a matter of fact, do a three-way with them. Call with them on the line with you. Set them up for an appointment tomorrow. We need to get our seniors. We've already, in our church, lost a number of members to COVID, and they're older. So we can't, and you've heard me say this before, let's not complain and then not show up. We know tomorrow, starting tomorrow, we can start getting people shots in their arms. So it's 8 o'clock. I need you to start calling as soon as we get off. We're going to get off in a few minutes. I need you to make sure that we flood the Solano County Fairgrounds tomorrow. Now, many people who are technology challenged are also transportation challenged, right? If you are transportation challenged, you need to let me know. And we'll try to figure out a way. Does the county have, and this may be something you don't have, and we can think about it creatively, for seniors who are transportation challenged? I know for Black Infant Health, we've been a part of voucher programs. How do we get past some of the barriers, especially that communities of color? And I know Dr. McNeil Sales is at Kaiser, you're with the county. One of the questions we're often asked is, if I'm not a member of Kaiser, how do I get a shot? We know many poor Black and brown people, the emergency room is their doctor. We know that Black and brown people are technology challenged. So is the county thinking of some ways to reach people who are technology challenged, who are transportation challenged? How do we advocate for that?
Yeah, and this is, I go back to the be patient. This is the, I'll pick you up and I'll take you, but we do have vans that we need to put in place to help with that situation. Like I said, we have vaccinated 36,000 people. A lot of that is, we're trying to be at a central place. Transportation can be an issue. So as much help as you can give to help getting seniors to the vaccine sites. I can tell you this, it is very important. I have a statistic out of 134 fatalities in our county, and everyone is devastating. 78% occurred with people who are over the age of 65. That should be a driver to get to your vaccine. 22% of those fatalities were African Americans. So it is very important to get to the vaccine. If you can't make it this week, though, what I would share is there's also a form on the vaccine site. It's the COVID-19 vaccine interest form. If you complete that form, that information goes into a database that can be manipulated by our public health officer staff, and then we will call people based on those answers when the next mass vaccine site comes open. And so, based on age, based on occupation, we will pull those numbers down and get you signed up. But you're right. Call the seniors and stay on the phone with them and log them in for an appointment.
Is the county open, and let's just say Bishop Brian Harris in South Vallejo, is the county open to doing what Oakland has done in certain places, using churches as vaccination sites because they're areas people know and trust and can get to?
Yep. We actually have a pop-up that's happening at Mount Calvary next week.
In Fairfield.
In Fairfield. And we plan to have these pop-ups all throughout the county because we know that we need to be neighborhood and community specific. A mass vac site is great because you can concentrate and bring in the resources for a big shootout, if you will, of shots. But we are looking to do the pop-ups because it is important to be in communities and neighborhoods where they feel comfortable being there as well.
So if you're in Fairfield next week at Mount Calvary. And we'll announce others as they
come due. They do take some time. These are partnerships that occur. It's not just county driven.
Yeah.
Kaiser is a huge partner of ours. They've brought in tremendous amount of resources for our vac site out at the fairgrounds. Medic Ambulance, Sutter has been a big support, as well as Touro University students. So it's an all hands on deck, as well as having a lot of volunteers to help people get from one station to the next, because there is a process with getting the vaccine. And so it is an event, if you will.
Sure.
Very well run. You sign up, you get your vaccine, you're asked to stay in a place where we can watch you and make sure that there's no bad side effects. We have medical care personnel everywhere to help in that event. We have not had that problem at any of our vac sites yet, so that's very positive. But yeah, when I'm eligible for the vaccine, I'm gonna get it. My husband has received the vaccine, at least the first dose. He gets his second dose on Monday. And if you can get it, and get it soon enough, get it sooner than later. The doctor was correct. There are strains out there that are, we're hearing that they are more deadly, that you'll be more sick, and they're easily transmissible, more easily transmissible than the original version of the COVID-19.
Sister Lisa, you had a question?
A couple of comments. So I wanted to address the question around what people can do if they don't have email. So if you're a Kaiser member, then you can always call the advice nurse, and they can leave a message for your primary care provider, and they can enter a message in secure messaging on your behalf. I also wanted to state that if you are on home health or hospice and you need transportation, Kaiser is providing that, because we are still in the process of working out the protocol for providing vaccines in home. The other thing that I wanted to state is that it's really important for everyone to know that wherever you get your first vaccination, you have to go back to that same place and get the second one. So you can't get one in Benicia and the second one at the fairgrounds. Both vaccines must be administered and received from the same location. Thank you.
Well, I think you just answered, you just said something, and the question was, if you get a first dose, will you be guaranteed a second dose? And the answer to that is yes. So if you get your first dose, and I think there's a lot of anxiety, especially amongst younger people who are under 65, who are ready. You just have to wait your turn. And I think it's also important that you don't believe that the vaccine is a get out of jail free card. You still need to mask up. You still need to stay socially distanced. You still need to wash your hands, because you can still pass it, according to the doctors, even if it's not affecting you directly. So I think we've hit every aspect. I think we've talked about the medical. We've talked about how you can advocate for yourself. County Supervisor Hannigan has helped us talk about where you can get a shot, the various locations, the pop-ups. We're going to continue to push and give information out. You had one other thing you wanted to tell us?
Well, I just wanted to share that this weekend is Super Bowl weekend, and know that this is a big weekend for where folks get together with family and friends. Please resist. Don't do it. There is light at the end of the tunnel. A vaccine is coming, but please do not do that to yourself or your family members. I know people who thought that they were in a small bubble. It was a big bubble, and it turned out that everybody got sick. It's really not worth it. One, to get sick, or two, to pass it on. It's just not worth it. So please avoid the temptation to get together with family and friends. Do it over Zoom.
Well, I've said, and we have not actually been in this sanctuary since last March. And I've said, if you love your grandmother, if you love your aunt, don't kill them. Let's not take this to each other. COVID is unpredictable. It can be mean to one person and asymptomatic to another. The reason we're doing this is because we're fighting for the lives of our community. So I'm going to beg you, let's get our seniors caught up. Let's phone bank tonight. Let's make sure we get them to the fairgrounds tomorrow. If they get their first dose, they're already halfway there. Also, remember the information that Lisa Jackson gave you. Make plans. As Black people, we don't like to talk about death. We don't like to deal with death. We don't like to talk about insurance. When we start talking about making life plans, we start accusing each other, wanting to kill each other. That is not the case. We gotta have open conversations. Our lives depend on it. You need medical directives, living wills. You need to make your desires clear. Lastly, keep listening and looking out for those who are not technology driven. Direct people to come view this. We're leaving this up on our sites. If they couldn't watch tonight, it's always going to be up for them to watch. I want to thank the doctors. They've logged off, but I want to thank them. We put the brightest Black medical professionals we could find. We had doctors and lawyers. They are intelligent people. I want to thank Lisa Jackson, social worker extraordinaire at Kaiser, one of our members, who's making sure that you have the best information you can have about how to navigate. And if you have questions, call the church. We'll make sure she gets your question. We're not going to give out her home number because y'all will call her at 2 a.m. in the morning. But it's important that you learn what happens once you get sick. How do I see mama? How do I navigate this? And then I want to thank Supervisor Hannigan, who came out and gave us the fairgrounds information. We've been trying to sign people up. I already know several of our members since we've been talking. Several of our seniors got signed up yesterday. They already have appointments at the fairgrounds. So we are already moving more and more of our older Black population there. I'm going to go across the street tomorrow to Juan, my Latino brother who runs the apartment complex across the street. It is a Spanish-speaking complex. We're going to let them know to call and get our Latino brothers and sisters over to the fairgrounds. After they call and get registered, I'm assuming there's a Spanish-speaking
Yes,
on the
will
website and
Tagalog
on the phone.
and Spanish.
Tagalog and Spanish. We're going to let everybody know. Let's get everybody vaccinated. Younger people, hold on. I know you want to get vaccinated. We're going to get you there too. Thank you for joining us. I pray you had an educational experience tonight. Know that Racism and Friendship Missionary Baptist Church and all of our partner organizations are going to continue to bring you the best advocacy and information we can get for you. We're now having a conversation about our next forum, which will be on sex trafficking and domestic violence. We're not making it a political issue. Some talked about it, but they had a purpose. We're going to talk about it because we want to make change. So I look forward to what we're going to do over the next couple of weeks, months. We're going to get people vaccinated. Thank you all for joining us. Have a great night. We'll look forward to seeing you Sunday. Jump in on us, 8 and 11. Have a great night.